What do we mean by contemporaneity and contemporary cinema? Cinema was invented in India back in late 19th century, and in 20th century it flourished. But when we talk of contemporaneous, we naturally believe in an era which began right after liberalization, that is from the 90s. And what do you see in the 90s? You see, on the one hand, initiation of the grand spectacular, say Sanjay Leela Bansali's Devdas, or say Dabang, say Bajirao Mastani. I am taking more or less a span of 20 to 25 years. You have seen these spectaculars and you have seen how computer generated effects have come into being in the cinemas. But I would argue that there is a parallel trend, not really meant for generating art cinema. Those are relatively low budget, those are steered by more adventurous and courageous directors like Anurag Kashyap and other people, and they are not that star driven. The star vehicle is relatively absent. Even if you find a star there, say Piku, you would see that the star plays a low tune, not like the old Dilip Kumar days. Amitabh Bachchan is given a subdued role. So what do you find? What all these things necessarily mean? They necessarily mean, or they indicate a kind of situation when India has entered into a kind of metropolitan consciousness. Before that, before the 1970s, we were more dependent on our rural backgrounds. It was a kind of feudal ambience from where the stars or the heroes or the heroines drew their inspiration. But nowadays, more importantly, you go down deeper to the lanes and bylanes of Mumbai and Kolkata, and you see the urban apartments instead of palatial villas and other things. And you see the protagonist playing a more commoner's role, and they use a kind of mixed language which is not typically chaste Urdu or correct Hindi, or that for that matter a kind of Bangla dialogue attested by Tagoriana. No, not like that. Life has become more meaningful for the commoners. It is what we call ordinary cinema or a cinema of our time. Let us go back to Vishal Bharadwaj's film. When he adapts Shakespeare, what do we see? We see not an evocation of the 16th century England environment. Instead of that, we see Kashmir, Punjab and other places, the dhabas, the low-light photography, only to indicate and generate a kind of Indian smell, Indian location and Indian specificity. I would say that despite globalization in down south, which we are used to call third world cinema, we see a kind of attempt to give birth to national cinema. Instead of following the Hollywood directly or the European art cinemas, we discover a typical Indianness and a kind of national pride which too often also speaks of a sensibility which is a kind of hegemonistic aspiration. Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. India is a big power, so it must be projected on the screen. And on the streets like Marine Drive and Rajarhat, you find India emerging as a big power, and the citizens who are moving in imported cars really smells money. That is the difference with the 50s, That is the difference with the rebellious 70s, and in contemporary times we are more concerned with the marital discord, with the conjugal problems. We are not that concerned with foreign invasion or that kind of patriotism which was so often there on the screen with Manoj Kumar and with the singers. We do not see that. The credit card has become more important than your national flag. There lies the globalization, value of globalization. During the 90s, Dil Se or any other film, Dil To Pagal Hai, say Kahana Pyar Hai. What do they indicate? Kahana Pyar Hai is a film, perhaps released in 1999 or 2000, advises you to go global. Everything is branded. The shirt, the hero wears, the trouser, the lady wears, the fashion magazine they read, the soft drink they take, everything happens under the aegis of branded companies. There you are. This is the intervention of the multinational and corporates in our life, and you are learning that grief and pleasure both can be bought and sold via a soft drink agency. Look at Kahana Pyar Hai. The fundamental, there are two climaxes. One is the death, the early death of the hero, and secondly, detection of the criminal. Who made the detection? Not like earlier films, a human being, but a simple mobile phone, a cellular phone, Nokia. That is the beginning of digital civilization in India. And what do you find? The central action takes place under a huge banner of Coca-Cola. What we note that there is no Chinese wall living in between the human emotions. You find grief, melancholia, sorrow, pathos, everything blended with pleasure, cheers and celebration. Really, there is no line of difference, no marginal line. This is a kind of postmodern situation where you can enjoy anguish with laughter. Even in commercial cinema, this kind of things were foregrounded. Say, if we compare and contrast the cinema of the 50s and the cinema of, say, 21st century, what do we see? Let us call and let us take into account the national situation, the question of national feeling, the question of national pride. You see, in the 50s, Raj Kapoor could say, "Fir bhi dil hai Hindustani." He could make "चीज़ जिसमें गंगा बहती है" or C 420. And now you find Amir Khan in 2006 making Lagan. Where lies the difference? The difference is fundamentally in the perception of nationhood. In Lagan, what do you find? You find the freedom struggle told in a metaphorical way, almost in like a one-day tournament. The British agreed to play cricket, and they are also agreeable to a situation where if they lose, they will leave the ground. And they really left. Gone are the days when you remember the affairs of cellular jail, the hanging of Khudiram, Bhagat Singh or Jallianwala Bagh. Because this is a level playing ground, because this being the era of globalization, you can enter into a buy and sell situation. You can have Hollywood cinema playing Chamma Chamma, and you can see that gone are the days of hatred and enmity. The Britishers can act as your friend in Lagan, and you really you are not expected to become that serious with freedom movement. It's like a cricket tournament, play it, lose it or win it. So, Lagan became like this. And there is no cause that you take very serious situations like Mughal Azam, Pyar Kya To Darna Kya, referred to Piku. This is about constipation, no harm done, our daily lives, our way of living, and these affected the regional cinemas, so-called regional cinemas also. If you look at the drawing rooms now created for popular or marketable Bangla cinema, what do you find? Gone are the old feudal sitting rooms of 50s and 60s. You find sleek furnitures, you find beer bottles, you find curtains with batik and other things. You find the horses, the earthen horses made in Bakura. This speaks of a kind of new sensibility of making a collage, a global collage in a local situation. We are saying about Bela Sheshe, where the protagonist Soumitra Chattopadhyay is trying to make you convinced that his wife should get acquainted with the modern way of living. That is why he took an alternate version of Taming of the Shrew and pretended that he would enter a divorce. And what do you see? A fundamental change in the affairs of perception. The children, his kids, they are trying to listen the parental conversation. This was unthinkable in the 50s. A new generation has arrived, and that you call contemporary generation. Their vocabulary are different. They are always bindas. One thing is particularly impressive about Bangla cinema, that Bangla cinema were and still remains to a great extent indebted to books in literary form. Usually in Bengal, people consider cinema as translations of literary works. But right from the 90s, partly because of the demise of a great star like Uttam Kumar, and partly because of the deterioration of the studio system, Bengali cinema opted for another way. Usually, they are not that fond of literature nowadays. They take stories from any place, from Telugu cinema, from newspaper reports, and they construct in their own. And you will see that both in Bollywood and in Kolkata, there is a change in the emphasis of hero-driven narratives. The heroes are not that important. You can find Shah Rukh Khan, you can find Prasenjit or Amitabh Bachchan, but they are more human. They are no longer given larger than life images. They do not descend from the Olympus mountains. That is a very important difference, because in an era of post-liberal democracy, a citizen must have his or her importance. And when he or she gets the importance, an individual dares to individuate himself or herself. And another thing to be noted, that in the earlier years, we were not that tuned to foreign cinemas or American cinemas. We largely borrowed from the narratives. Say, Random Harvest gave inspiration to Haranasur to Ajoy Kar in 1957. But we would not quote from foreign cinemas. And now you would see, if you look at Anurag Kashyap and other filmmakers, Vishal Bharadwaj and others, you will see huge quotes from American modernist filmmakers like Tarantino. You find Godfather in a way represented in Gangs of Wasseypur. You find blood, and you know that this blood ultimately came out from the veins of Tarantino. The violence, the global violence, not typical, tuned to Villa Parle, in Mumbai. And when you look at the storyline of Bangla cinema also, you would find that gone are the days of feudal family setup. It's mainly a nostalgic reference to the earlier era that existed, and a more specific story on the conjugal narratives, on the failed attempt to remain united. You find always a gap, and through this gap enters the city, enters modern consumer practice, and you find a new era has begun. That is all about contemporary cinema, because contemporary cinema has reversed the Indian scenario as such. India began with Hindu mythologicals. It believed in gods. If you go back to 1921, 100 years ago, you find religion taking the front seat and gods usually address you. And then you find familial dramas everywhere, in Delhi, in Mumbai, in Kolkata, in Tamil Nadu, everywhere. But then, right from the beginning of the 70s, with the growing importance of the city-based middle class, you find stories which are not that based on collectivity. It gives proper importance to individuals. Say Dev D. We had number of Devdas in Indian cinema, from Dilip Kumar and Bimal Rai, from Pramotesh Barua and Kundal Lal Saigal. I am not speaking of others. That what is the fundamental difference between Dev D and say earlier Devdases? Here the protagonist is Paro. The story looks at Paro and how she behaves. This is a change which is not only an awareness of gender consciousness, but also a change in the ways of seeing of things. So, Indian cinema just now is at a crossroad. They are telling you things, sometimes from urban fringe areas, sometimes from the mainstream. And when they speak from the mainstream, they speak of an ideology which is a dominant ideology, which is the voice of the ideological state apparatus. The films that you see like Bajirao Mastani and others, they rather train you on the regional aspirations and regional nationalism. And when you look at the more ordinary things, you see how people's lives have become so important, and how you can practice a kind of peeping Tomism, a kind of voyeurism into people's lives. And these peoples are not wretched, they no longer are the wretched of the earth. India has undergone a metamorphosis as far as the economic front is concerned. So you find a change in the costumes, in ways of speaking, in behavioral pattern, in their day-to-day usage and other things. This is mainly contemporary cinema, and since this contemporary cinema delivers you the ultimate thing through a digital mode, it is much more perfected. There you are, the makers, the persons behind the camera, behind the sound system are also educated people. You clearly understand the influence of these film institutes everywhere, say Pune Film Institute or SRFTI or other private institutes. The signature of a cultivated mind is everywhere, and that is why Indian cinema is gaining ground even outside India, among the NRIs and among the foreigners. This is not typical Indian masala, but a part of global culture. That is the achievement of the era.